Thank you so much for thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. Gwyn said I'm a relatively new member, but I'm a long in the tooth environmentalist, if you like. So, just give you a little bit of background. So, I'm a zoologist, and I've worked in international conservation, and that's something I'm really passionate about. Through my career, I worked for Chester Zoo in the early days, and then when I was in university in the States, I set up the Earth Day Festival at our campus and recycling on our campus. And then in grad school, I worked on setting up the second curbside recycling program in the US after Seattle. And right out of university, I worked for Clean Water Action, and we were lobbying on the ozone layer to rule out CFCs on acid rain, both of which were successful. Uh, I was at the Nature Conservancy, and they're the largest land-based nature charity in the world. And here in the UK, I've worked for the Woodland Trust. So that was really my introduction into carbon offsetting, because the Woodland Trust was the charity who set up the Woodland Carbon Code with the Forestry Commission and with one other partner at the time. So that was early days. That was about 17 years ago. And so when I set up Highland Carbon, really, it was because I'm passionate about the environment and about mitigating climate change, but also I'm passionate about biodiversity loss and restoring habitat. So that was my journey to here. And Highland Carbon has been going since 2017, and hopefully you should be able to see a few slides on the screen, which I'm going to work through. So before I go through the slides, I'm just going to make a few key points, and I think these are the takeaway points for the whole of the presentation. The first one is the importance to work within officially recognized frameworks, which are third-party inspected and validated, rather than self-generated frameworks. There's a number of organizations who set up their own frameworks, which are not third-party monitored, and that's a little like marking your own homework. The second point is to make sure that the offsetting is traceable. So that's typically traded on a commodity exchange so that it can only be sold and retired once. The other thing, which is really important and becoming more important these days, is the co-benefits from any project. And that's because organizations report on not just carbon, they report on biodiversity, water quality, and many other things. And the final key point that we're going to cover is managing risks to do with certain projects which may have reputational risks, or certain parts of the world where things can be a little bit tricky. So as you'll see on the first slide, we've won the award for Best UK Offset Supplier for the last 3 years, including this year, which we were notified about last week, which we're really happy about. And I think that's a reflection of the sort of projects we do. And I will highlight a little bit about what we do, just by way of giving some examples of the sort of thing to look for. So the do's and don'ts of carbon offsetting. The main point to take away in terms of the market itself is that there are two markets. So there's the mandatory market and there's the voluntary market. We're going to focus today on the voluntary market, but I will touch on a few points about the mandatory market. Generally speaking, when people talk about offsetting, they conflate the two, and especially when there's any debate around it, they tend to conflate the two and not really understand the voluntary market. You all will know this pretty well, I imagine very well, compared to the general public, but most people don't really understand the nuance there. So the cap and trade market, which is the mandatory market, is for heavy polluters in effect. So this is things like heavy industry, manufacturing, steel production, glass, and so on. So this market, it's called cap and trade because each company is given a limit on how much they can pollute. They must cap it, and if they don't manage to achieve that limit, they have to purchase credits of companies who have surpassed their cap. And those caps reduce year on year, and it's very expensive for these companies to buy offsets in this way. So one of the big misconceptions, sorry, is that these companies are just happily polluting as much as they like, and there's no restraint on them. This is a market which is being restrained, and they are endeavoring to reduce their footprint. And there's some really interesting breakthroughs coming through with steel production as it relates to arc electricity, airlines in relation to sustainable fuel that's on the horizon and is starting. So these companies are also doing their bit, but there's more than they can do. I'm not in this market at all. I'm only in the voluntary market, so we're going to focus on that. So all other businesses fall into the voluntary market. And so if I was to give you an example, a couple of my clients are, for example, an architect's firm and a fashion brand. So it's not really the sort of companies that people think about when they raise concerns about offsetting. Um, and these companies, because of course they don't have to do this, they're only doing it to be good company citizens. So they're not, to use a term that gets circulated, they're not getting away with offsetting. They don't have to do it in the first place. And they're actually really keen on it. But in some cases, they don't really communicate about it because they're worried about pushback when it comes to greenwashing. So it's kind of a subtle arena, but it's a massive market. And when it relates to the UK, companies can only offset their UK emissions through UK. Sorry, I should say it the other way around. UK offsets can only be bought for UK emissions, but they can also buy on the international market. We do also sell offsetting on the international market within the various recognized frameworks. So we'll touch on that a little bit as we go through it. So the voluntary code here in the UK for nature-based solutions includes the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. The Woodland Carbon Code is administered by the forestry commissions in each of the devolved governments. So in my case, that's primarily Scottish Forestry, as they're now called. And the Peatland Code is administered by the International Union of Conservation and Nature. And all of these frameworks are third-party inspected, certified, and validated. So there's no marking one's own homework, and it's extremely robust protocol that's involved here. The third parties for inspections are the Soil Association and the Organic Growers and Farmers Association. These are the official frameworks which count towards the UK's commitment to the Paris Agreement, alongside renewable energy and everything else that is going on. So other nature-based options, as I understand it, do not. It's a developing field. There will be new opportunities coming through. One of them is called soil carbon, which relates to farming, which has not yet been formalized. And yet another one is something called blue carbon, which will relate to seaweed. And again, that has not yet been formalized. So these are in the development stages, but I expect they'll come into play in the next year or two in each case. So there will be an expanding pool of official nature offsets. Just to highlight a little bit of the scale of what we do, to give you an idea, we have so far planted around 4 million trees through our different projects, and we have very large sort of landscape scale projects, and we use science to determine where we put them. And we wanted to really stand out from the market because when we set up Highland Carbon, most of the projects that were out there were small, and they entailed planting on arable farmland rather than returning nature to what it would have been like at the Roman times, for example. So these are diverse native tree planting schemes. They can have some elements of timber in them. That is being reduced over time according to the Woodland Carbon Code framework. We endeavor to have permanent native schemes. In some cases, estates elect to also have timber on the estate. And we can have a proper chat about that, I think, in the conversation at the end about how that works and what the implications are. But that window is really closing, and I don't think it is always going to be available to have non-native trees at all within this code in future. We also work within the peatland code. So in the Woodland Carbon Code, essentially, CO2 is being locked into the biomass of the trees in the trunks, the roots, and the branches as the trees grow. And that's why it cannot be applied to existing forests. It is only newly planted forests. It's different with the peatland code. So the peatland applies to an avoidance. And what's being avoidance here is the emission of methane. So peatlands, which existed on hillsides and sometimes in valleys in blanket bogs, there was incentives for landowners and farmers to drain them off to convert the land to grazing. And that has been done for so long now that the land is in an extremely damaged state, typically in these locations. It's no good for grazing. Lambs get stuck in the gullies. It's no good for shooting estates because the chicks get stuck in gullies and get picked off by predators. So the land is pretty much low value. Bring it into this market offers some value to that land. So it's beneficial to the landowners. It's beneficial to generating revenue, which will sustain the projects over time. So this, as I say, is an avoidance, and that has implications for the kind of offsetting that people buy, as opposed to a sequestration in the case of the woodland carbon code. The great thing with the woodland habitats is they bounce back within a couple of years. The trees are around 2 meters high, typically. With the wetland habitats, they bounce back almost immediately because there is dormant seed within the peat itself. And then, of course, as wildlife move in, they carry seed and they carry eggs of amphibians and everything else. So insects take off, bird life takes off relatively quickly, and they become very abundant, inspirational landscapes. And keeping in mind that the UK has more of this kind of habitat than anywhere in the world, and the vast majority of it is damaged, this is a huge opportunity for the UK to do its bit on a global scale. So there's various different concepts to consider when you're looking at offsetting. And the first one is what's known as bundling. So bundling is in effect when you achieve various outputs within a single unit. So for every single ton of offset that is sold, you can achieve a whole range of things. And I've got some examples on here and I'll go through them individually, but it's, it's community benefits, biodiversity, and so on. We are very keen in our case to offer as much as possible in this arena. That adds value for the landowner, but it also means that our projects are high quality and they offer a very strong narrative that companies can then use in their communications. And our projects are in spectacular locations, so it's very rich content available for our company partners who buy from us. And as you can see here, these are sustainable development goals. This is an example of one project which we sold recently, which is in the Tweed River catchment in the Scottish borders, and it achieves several sustainable development goals outputs. So these SDGs are set by the United Nations, so they apply to everywhere in the world. They cascade down from the United Nations to each nation, and then to all of the companies and the agencies within each nation who report back on them. So this is something that our customers can report on to show that they are going above and beyond and really achieving something that is exciting and exceptional. The other concept is something called stacking. So stacking is when you have different units, each of them is its own entity, but they are purchased together. And so that can be done within the UK. And an example of that would be biodiversity net gain credits, which are available in England and will be available in Scotland in the foreseeable future, sold alongside offsetting and other measurable outcomes. So each unit has its own value, but they're typically traded as a package, hence the term stacking. Stacking can be done also with international units. This is something we do because we also sell offsetting through projects in about 80 countries. From India to Brazil to Turkey to Southeast Asia, Australia, all over the world. So in our case, we can help companies to achieve a bespoke cocktail solution. They can achieve a whole range of hallmarks, some of which we offer and some of which are the standardized hallmarks. And they can achieve particular claims as it relates to net zero or carbon neutral, for example. because those claims only relate to certain kinds of projects. Nature positive, for example, only relates when you are improving something, or putting something there which isn't already there. So just to give an example, if you protect a tropical forest which is already there, as much as that's a wonderful thing to do, it is not a nature positive output. Planting a forest which isn't there is a nature positive output. So that's an example of stacking. Unfortunately, international offsets can be affordable relative to UK offsetting, and that's because our sort of projects are capital intensive. It takes a lot of labor to plant 1 million trees, for example, and to go through all of the planning and the regulation that's involved. So we're getting into the do's now. I'm going relatively quickly, which is good because we're going to have some time for conversation. Do look at the various co-benefits and consider your own sort of ethical policy, so that when you are dealing with the market and you are dealing with your individual company clients, you can speak confidently with them about your own culture and the sort of things you do and won't do. And that's because this sector is very much debated and discussed, so it's good to have a solid footing. We very much endeavor to support communities as well as nature in a range of ways, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we touched on only supporting traceable offsetting on official commodity exchanges. There's a fair amount of offsetting that happens off the books. I would avoid that entirely. Or if you're buying from somebody who is on a commodity exchange, make sure that they can demonstrate and prove to you that all of the certificates that they are providing and the reports that they're providing come off an official commodity exchange. If they don't, it's a fuzzy area. It's a global market. You don't always know who's involved with it. I would avoid it. So we talked about the official recognized frameworks. Always ask your broker, whoever it is, which frameworks they work in and whether or not they count to the United Nations Paris Agreement targets, to the aims and to the targets which are revising at every COP meeting. If they're not official, it makes it much harder for the buyer to report on them. And the other one is to ask the broker about their code of ethics. In our case, our code of ethics has around 20 points, and it includes a whole range of things. And we're going to talk about them a little bit as we go through these slides. So in our case, for example, there's certain sectors we don't deal with. A number of those get ruled out anyway because they should be in the mandatory market if they're heavy industry. But we add to that, take it a little bit further. All of our clients are actively reducing their carbon footprints. We talk to them about their journey. And in fact, they're typically coming to us when they've already been working with a consultant who has been advising them on how to implement their reduction. And therefore, they have smart objectives, measurable time-based goals that they're working towards. We also have clients who perhaps only aren't reducing their carbon footprints because they're startup companies. And those startup companies are offering green solutions to the marketplace. So that could be around transport or energy or technology or whatever that is. We will come alongside them, but they will also commit to minimizing their carbon footprint and to reducing it in future. They can't reduce it to date because they're startups, so that's reasonable. So an example of that is one of our customers, startup customers, is a virtual reality company, and they offer a green training solution so that their customers don't have to travel all around the world. Another one is a whiskey company. So it was a startup which has only ever worked with sustainable fuel. Protecting the rights of tenant farmers, this is really important. This gets talked about internationally. You'll hear this talked about in relation to native people in South America typically, or in the Pacific Rim. But we should really apply those principles here at home as well. Carbon offsetting can create an incentive to clear people off the land, and that is the last thing that we want. We don't want to repeat the Highland clearances or anything like it. So think about ways that locals can benefit. There are a lot of opportunities in the green economy in remote communities, so there is an upside, and that's something to ask about and for us to focus on. Public access is really important to us, so that includes rambling and cycling paths, horse riding, bridle paths sometimes, where possible. This is something we discuss with our landowner clients, and so that we can work that into the design of the schemes wherever possible to link up with other networks. So our project, which we just sold at the at Traquair in the Tweed River Valley, the network of paths on that project connects to the Tweed River Valley Forest, which is a national park, and that connects even further out to Glen Tress, which has the British Centre for Mountain Biking and various other things. So it's a bigger network, which is brilliant. In Scotland, of course, there's right to roam anyway, and right to wild camping. So it's generally in place, but it's a good conversation to have. We do not plant on arable land because we're planting large schemes for our offsetting, which are typically in hill country. So they're not on moorland either. The moorland is left intact. It's on the hillsides. And the other thing that's really important to us is that we are transparent with everybody as it relates to the price at which we sell and the price at which we buy and our margin. And we believe in terms of the brokering space in the UK that we have the lowest margin. Certainly we've published it and we've never been challenged on it. So we believe that's very important. And we offer a carbon tracker value guarantee to our landowner customers and a low commission guarantee to our buyers and to our landowner partners. That's an important point. It might seem like a small thing. You may think that we did this just to disrupt the market. It was an opaque market, and that was one of the things that we were thinking about. But the more important point here is it means that the vast majority of the money is going into the project. And that's important to make sure that the project is sustainable, because these projects need to be maintained over generations often. The woodland projects are typically maintained for 65 years, the peatland ones typically for 100 years. So it's very important that there's a small margin to maximize those projects. Green employment opportunities are enormous. This figure should be 18 million. So essentially it's 15 million pounds in relation to the projects that we've worked on of capital funding, which comes from government agencies. And then it's a £3 million match from carbon sales. And that's where the additionality comes in. And some of the places that we work are described as the remotest in the UK. So that includes the Outer Hebrides, it includes the centre of that, the Scottish Highlands, and other remote places in England, for example, where there's very little full-time, year-round employment, and opportunities to work in the green economy are fantastic for remote communities like that, where they can't commute to Glasgow or Edinburgh or wherever. It's just too far away. Community well-being is something that we're passionate about. So we are enhancing the aesthetics of the landscape, which is important to us for nature, but it's also important for people in those local areas and for ecotourism, which is an important part of the economy. In Scotland, where we mainly work, tourism is, I think, the third or fourth biggest sector in their economy. So it's a very big one and has a huge impact. Our projects, because they're at scale, improve water quality, and that's especially true with the peatland projects because you have essentially a giant filter of sphagnum on the hillside, which it buffers the rate at which water flows off the hill and it filters it as it comes off the hill. The same benefits can happen with forestry to a lesser extent. And then allied to that is the reduced risk of extreme flooding events. And relating to that is river water quality. So one of the big issues that we have in Scotland and in Northern England is salmon are becoming at risk. And they're at risk because climate change is warming the rivers and it's creating spating within the rivers. So the river levels are fluctuating significantly and silting. So spawning areas for salmon and for trout are at threat. And so this is helping to buffer that effect on the rivers and to benefit biodiversity in that way. In our case, we support a whole range of different educational activities. I'll highlight one of them, which is our food forests. So we've been putting these in place in a number of different communities. And the food forest is essentially a local asset. So the landowner makes the land available The trees are planted, so they're fruit trees and fruit bushes, and sometimes allotments for vegetables. And it's an asset for the community, and volunteers are involved in maintaining it. The funding is provided, so we put funding in, and the landowner puts funding in to create these projects. And they can be very helpful in the remotest communities where fresh food could be an hour drive away, and where people, only do a big shop every month because they have to travel so far to get into town. And of course, there's a whole range of educational benefits and nutritional benefits. I think we've covered public access, but I think this is an important point, is that this is about people as much as it is about nature. We are living on this planet. I know we often think of the environment as being separate from people, but it's very much integrated. And one of the things that's quite fun in Scotland is that doctors can prescribe time in nature for people's well-being and mental health. And so this is something that may be coming to England, we'll see, but it's certainly already there in Scotland. So I'm going to go through the don'ts now. The context of don'ts is it's within the umbrella of carbon offsetting. Do sponsor a tree if you want to. We support tree planting. If you were selling offsetting, however, to a company and they are needing to report officially on it, ask if the tree planter is making that an official thing that you can offset, because often in communications it'll say every 4 trees is a ton of carbon or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a formal offset. And certainly when I worked at the Woodland Trust, we sold both. Most of what we sold was sponsor a tree, and we sold, there's around 15 million pounds of that a year. I think we sold around 3 million pounds for offsetting. So do ask, because only one of them can be officially reported when it comes to carbon footprints and counting towards net zero, carbon neutral, and so on. Don't use developers who mark their own homework. So make sure that whoever you work with is working with an officially recognized framework that is also vetted by third parties. There are some new frameworks that are coming about at the moment, and I've been on Zoom meetings with a number of them where they have invented their own framework and they mark their own homework. That's risky because you can't trust 100% that they'll be accurate. All the stuff that we do is audited to the hilt. So it's not just auditing that the trees are there, it's auditing that the quantity of the species of trees in each category are there and the tonnage of carbon is there. So it's a very detailed audit, and that's the kind of thing that you want, really. Don't buy units outside of the recognized frameworks. Have conversations around how official they are, but do your own research. Don't rely just on what the seller tells you about how pucker the units are. Don't assume that charities have the best supply. So don't assume that they are the highest quality or the most efficient projects or with the best sustainability outcomes. So I mean, the specific example I have is I worked for the Woodland Trust, and there was a great charity. I've still got a lot of friends there, and I loved working with them. But they didn't have a science department. They didn't set KPIs for biodiversity outputs. They did communicate about biodiversity in general. And the location of where the trees were planted, those weren't selected based on scientific aims, such as sites of special scientific interest or special conservation areas. So if you want to have the maximum impact for nature and support quality projects that have the greatest impacts, look for that sort of thing. And don't assume that it's the charity sector necessarily. And don't assume that they have the lowest overheads, because they don't compare to us. In terms of guidance, I think we've covered a lot of this, but just have a lot of active conversation with whoever is supplying with you to ask these points which we have discussed and gone through, and make sure that you can get an official report that can be used in the ESG report by your company client, so that there's no blowback on that company. Because if there's blowback on any one of your clients, it obviously risks the reputation of your business, and that's something you want to protect for your own purposes. also have active conversations about what can be counted towards net zero and carbon neutral. Of course, net zero relates to a whole company, so they have to cover everything. That's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which we'll talk about in a moment. Carbon neutral can relate to any one thing. So our latest customer is a furniture company, and the production of their furniture is carbon neutral. They're not a net zero company, so they haven't covered all of their premises, they haven't covered all of their staff travel, they haven't covered their supply chain. But they've covered the biggest part of their footprint, which is production, and that means they can market a net zero furniture item within all of their marketing. And in our case, we achieved that by stacking the international units with UK units so that they could be carbon neutral, I meant to say, nature positive, and climate positive, because they're buying 2 tons for every 1 ton. And that particular client of ours is very happy that they can make all those claims with confidence. I've got a few examples of risks and things to consider. And everybody really has their own threshold for these, so make your own mind up about it when you reflect on it. But there's a big difference between sustainable forestry and afforestation. One of the issues at the moment, as I look at a lot of the registers we work in, there's a big rise in sustainable forestry, and typically those are timber plantations. And typically where the credits come from is the timber company agreeing to reduce the amount of timber that they're going to clear. So there's a potential perverse incentive to clear land of high quality habitat, set up timber plantations, and be rewarded for it. So that is something to keep in mind if you're having conversations about sustainable forestry. In some cases, it can be a really good thing, because you can have, agroforestry where trees are planted between coffee and chocolate plantations and so on to enable wildlife to move through. That's putting something perhaps positive in, but even then there can be some risks. So that's one to consider. The other one is governance risks. So we gold plate things in the UK, like we do with health and safety and other things. And I know we joke about it internally here, but we notice it when we travel somewhere and they don't gold plate their health and safety, don't we? Well, it's the same with offsetting. Other countries don't have the same standards necessarily. They don't have the same governance and inspection regimes, and so consider, certain countries, whether to be involved with them. In some cases, countries, for example, American countries, cannot trade in North Korea. There's a law about that, so you cannot, even if you wanted to, you couldn't sell units from there to an American business. There's other things to consider. For example, a lot of companies now, they report on anti-slavery, they report on money laundering and all sorts of other things. If a country is known for any of those things, China has issues, for example, with slavery as it relates to internment of the Uyghur people and other issues. Consider that risk. If your customer is a fashion company and they are reporting that they are against slavery, something to think about anyway in terms of the countries where you work. Public access we've covered, I think, pretty well to make sure that the opportunities for the community. Exploitation, I think we've covered. Communications, this is an important one. Will the project pass the smell test? When the public gets to hear about it and learn about it, will the company who's your customer benefit, or do they have reputational risks that will arise from that project? Sometimes the reputational risks are not because the project is bad, it's because it isn't clear what the project is, if you see what I mean. So think of projects which are very easy to communicate so that people don't raise questions unnecessarily about them. And go beyond that, source projects which are exceptional and filmic and deliver everything that can help the companies to have a strong brand. I think we covered carbon neutral relates to one thing. We've covered net zero, which relates to any whole company. We've covered nature positive, which is restoring nature rather than just protecting what's there. I think we've covered climate positive, which is going beyond the carbon footprint of each company in terms of the tonnage that you purchase. This is a slide on what Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 covers. These slides will be available to all of you as part of this Eventbrite package. They'll be saved onto the event. So I'm not going to go through these in detail now, and it's an evolving picture anyway. And something that was raised at the very beginning before everyone joined this was there's a Scope 4 now as well. So just, keep abreast of what all of this covers when you are consulting with your clients. And that is it from me.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was very inspiring, actually, because we've had a lot of bad news, particularly today, recently. So it's really good to hear of such a holistic approach and working with all sizes of companies, because a lot of small companies I work with really are confused by just how far they can go. But I think you've offered a lot of insights there. Please feel free to put some questions in the chat box, or just raise your hand. And Julia Sampson, who, by the way, this is the first meeting she's been with us. She's recently joined our team to support us in all our events, and specifically focusing on getting our contribution to the EcoFest sorted out. So I've just got a first question to Richard to kick it off. Yeah, the holistic nature of everything you do was really impressive. It's not just about carbon, it's about community and well-being, etc., and access. How much do you get involved in the classic, regenerative farming projects where farms are turned back over to regenerative processes?
We will be when the soil carbon standard comes out, because that will be something that's tradable. And so, yeah, it's something that we do take a great interest in. That will relate to essentially having this is the slightly strange thing about this market. A project only qualifies if there's damage. So you can't plant a new forest unless the forest has been eradicated. You can't sell peatland offsetting unless the peatland has been almost destroyed. You can't sell regenerative farming unless the farm is damaged. So the soil carbon will essentially be putting in place organic measures to make sure that the soil substructure recovers. The broader picture of regenerative farming covers other things like tree planting, rewilding buffers, and so on. We are not involved ourselves in selling those, but we bring in third parties. So when we meet with a big estate, a number of the estates we work with have farming operations. We will bring in other people, and they will be advising around rewilding in general. So that's everything from rewilding dry meadows, wet meadows, river rewilding, planting woodlands in ways which wouldn't work as a carbon offsetting project because there's not enough quantity, or they can't be inspected very easily, and so on. So yes, we're involved with it, but we're not trading it as offsetting at the moment.
Julia, for some reason, we can't hear you, although you're... Okay, you're muted now, so you should...
Can you hear me now?
That's it, yeah.
Okay,
No,
it's a bit quiet.
quiet. I'll sort it out in just a second. But I was going to say, Rebecca, we'll come to you in a minute. But maybe Giles, I see you raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's more of a comment or an aside, I guess, really, rather than a question. But I signed up to Tree Wilder yesterday. Yay me! But I've been a Carbon Trap subscriber for a while now, and Carbon Trap plant elephant grass. And my comment was just about sort of the relative merits of different schemes, particularly the relative merits of elephant grass as opposed to tree planting, because Carbon Trap's argument, I guess, is that you plant a tree, it may not reach full maturity, so it can take 10, 20 or even 30 years to capture carbon before it reaches full maturity. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, is that valid? Is that a fair enough point? And, you know, are we better off choosing one particular scheme over another one?
I would say look at the whole market, because there's all sorts of benefits and all sorts of merits to different projects, and consider what you want. So I'm going to give you an example within our framework, within our sector. So I mentioned at the beginning that it's possible to have some timber within some of these projects, the forest projects. Believe it or not, some buyers want that. They really want it. And the reason they really want it is because timber grows far faster than native broadleaves. So if you have Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, for example, within a project, the rate at which the carbon will be drawn down out of the atmosphere is much faster. And in those cases, there's what's called continuous cover. So those trees are removed selectively and replanted. The carbon calculation is only up to the point where the trees are removed. And I can tell you that when I worked at the Woodland Trust, we were actually very pro on this as a policy standpoint, because if you cut carbon, you convert it to timber and you put it in a building, you actually lock it up completely. I know this sounds bonkers. If you leave a woodland in its natural state, you reach a stasis where trees are seeding and growing and others are dying, and the ones that are dying are emitting methane and CO2. The ones that are growing are trapping it, which is why our projects, the woodland projects, only have a duration of 65 years, because that's when you reach that sort of stasis. The other thing to consider is how important are the biodiversity impacts of the project, and does it matter? I think that for the climate movements, the climate extinction movement, biodiversity is entwined with the narrative, and it certainly is for, you know, the likes of Sir David Attenborough and others who are leading, you know, the narrative in this arena. So the buyers who I've been involved with are really keen on the biodiversity side and doing something positive there. How fast does it grow? With peatlands, the methane emission stops immediately. So as much as that project was emitting, as soon as the site is saturated, the pH changes and it stops emitting, and that's immediate, and the biodiversity benefit is immediate. What we see with our woodland projects is that we have to fence most of our projects off from deer because they're in Highland locations often where there's a lot of red deer. If we don't do that, the deer will obliterate the planting. And if you have trees that are seeding outside of an enclosure like that, where you have established pines, those trees won't produce seedlings because they get eaten. So we have to put up the fencing. What happens next is you get a whole range of flowers and other plant life that blooms, and you get the trees growing through. So within 2 months, we'll often have you know, black grouse within these enclosures, and red grouse, and all sorts of ground nesting birds, which wouldn't have been in that section of the estate before. Within a year or so, the trees can be about 1 meter high, and then you have a lot of, you know, songbirds who benefit from the whole raft of seeds that are being produced. Remember, these seedlings are already producing fruit and seeds, so the saplings themselves can be very productive and useful for the landscape. And within a few years, you know, it's pretty well on its way. As we like to say, it's off to the races. The trees will establish. And for our big projects, we've got one of our projects which we're doing on the coast of Galloway has 2 million trees. It's the size of 2,000 football pitches. That's a vast area. And if you can imagine, once the deer fences come down, which they do, then you've got this rich habitat, you know, for a whole range of wildlife. So elephant grass, I'm not against it. People should do what they want, but I wouldn't say that there aren't immediate benefits from the other two.
No, fair enough. Good to know. So I'm not necessarily doing any harm but it's not necessarily any better than another solution. Is that the takeaway point, I guess?
Yes, I think if you look at the Woodland Carbon Code itself, is essentially about returning forest to what it would have been. So the main principle is, native trees in the right place, allowing for some timber. I put that caveat on there. But really the aim of the Forestry Commission is to return native forests. So if you put elephant grass in an area where it isn't native, then the wildlife which would have lived within it won't benefit. Will the native wildlife benefit? Maybe, but probably not to the same extent. So it's not completely black and white. And an example I'll give is if you look at timber plantations and you think they'd be terrible for nature, the timber sections of our projects, the older projects which allowed a bit more timber, they benefit red squirrels and pine martens and Scottish wildcats. And actually, if the ospreys or the eagles are going to nest in them, they're going to nest in the Douglas fir first or a Sitka spruce before they nest in a Scots pine, because they grow faster and they're taller. So the narrative that non-native trees have no benefit, I wouldn't entirely agree with, but I would say that monocrop plantations aren't great for wildlife.
Sure. Well, I'm covering both bases because I'm now subscribed to both schemes, so all good.
Well, thank you for supporting Tree Wilder. That is our business to consumer and to small business brand. So Highland Carbon is our brand for our larger company clients.
Sure. I mean, do you want to talk a bit more about that, Richard? Sorry, I'm not taking over the meeting, but yeah, if you just want to mention a bit more about Tree Wilder, I don't know if folks would be interested in that. Sorry, I have some questions coming in as well. I'll shut up now.
It's a monthly subscription scheme, so it's a simple way to offset a year of carbon.
Hello, I'll ask my question because I stuck it in the chat anyway. So I've got a client at the moment, runs a driving school and wants to deliver offsets on his land. And so obviously there's a reputational risk there. And we kind of, I know about biodiversity net gain and other options like that as well. But if you were managing that entire thing, then how long does that process actually take to build that partnership? And I know that's difficult, ballpark figures, etc., but it'd be nice to understand how that process would work.
Yeah, so it takes about 3 years, and that's because when you do projects in nature, it's similar to construction. You have to get planning permission, and the planning permission it includes a period of public consultation. And in our case, that consultation is with the RSPB and the Wildlife Trusts and various other entities, as Forestry Commission, for example, as well as the local community. So they have an opportunity to object, which, believe it or not, in the past, sometimes they would, because people didn't really understand that there used to be forests where they live because they've seen them as they are for so long. But now that rarely happens because there's a lot of education that goes on in terms of returning it. The bureaucracy really isn't anything to do with us. It is just, going through the red tape with all of the regulators. Yeah, so it can take a few years.
And why do you need planning permission then if it's like private land for that kind of project? Just interesting.
Well, you do in order to qualify for the woodland grant schemes.
Okay.
Where you get the capital, or the peatland grant schemes.
So you've got to tick the white boxes.
And then you also need it to sell the carbon.
Okay, fine. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was just going to ask Rebecca if potentially she'd like to ask her question out loud. Otherwise, I can put it to you, Richard.
Yeah, I can ask it out loud if you can hear me. Just wanted to be reminded of what Scope 4 emissions are. I think I have read about it before, but it slipped my mind.
I think I'll defer to Paul, because Paul Harper brought this up just at the beginning.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the first few minutes.
Very kind, Richard. Thank you for Thank you for volunteering me there. So scope 4 is as yet kind of properly defined scope. So it's still being kind of mooted around by the same boffins who created the first 3 scopes, the World Resources Institute. But broadly speaking, it's almost the opposite of the first 3 scopes. So scope 4 is all about avoided emissions rather than emissions that happen.
Right.
So one example that's used quite often is, for example, if a company produces low power LED lighting, their product, if you think about it, is actually, when it's used by a consumer, is reducing the amount of carbon that's being emitted by not using a kind of a non low energy kind of product. It's a positive, yeah. So you can look at it in terms of, so it's good to have a big scope 4 emission effectively if you're a company, because that means that you are, offsetting more of what potentially might happen. It kind of, it opens a whole bunch of kind of academic questions around how it can be measured properly and the kind of the other bits and pieces that sit around it. But broadly speaking, which is probably why it's not a formal scope as yet. But yeah, it's certainly one that's being looked at.
Potential for greenwash there too, no doubt as well.
Very much so, because you can think, okay, well, that LED light might reduce emissions over there, but if it actually took 4 times as much carbon to produce it as a standard light, then where does that sit? Sort of thing, So you have to look at the supply chain broadly speaking. But yeah, again, this is probably why it's not a formal kind of scope that can be pinned. While I've got my mic off, actually, Richard, good presentation, by the way. I've got a question, which is a bit of a devil's advocate question, but I'll kind of couch it first by saying that my job is to help customers reach carbon neutrality, and we work to BSI PAS 2060. So we're already on board with what you guys are doing, and I know the Woodland Carbon Code is part of that. So absolutely great. One thing we are looking at, though, or seeing, and I know larger companies are seeing this as well, or looking at this as well, is they're kind of moving away from the concept of carbon neutrality a little bit. So what they're saying is, okay, we absolutely want to commit to a net zero target, and we absolutely want to reduce carbon emissions year on year to achieve that. But rather than pay for the carbon credits, the carbon offsets, which can be, as you know, anything from £10 to £50 a ton, we will keep that money in-house and actually invest it into decarbonisation projects. So the kind of there is a not a massive but a gentle move away in some areas to that. I don't know if you've seen that, and I think if you've got any comments on that, and I think around the broader piece that you're talking about, so the biodiversity and everything else, the climate positive stuff alongside net zero, I think is a great kind of argument. But I just wanted your kind of thoughts on that, if you'd seen it and where you think it's sort of going.
Yes, I've seen that. I think there's 2 elements here. One is companies wanting to support biodiversity projects, which are external, and I'm seeing that more and more. So a number of my clients, I sell them the offsetting, but they report on the biodiversity outputs. The narrative is really not around offsetting at all. And some of them have moved that way because of the Guardian article from earlier, which I'll touch on briefly in a moment. In terms of within their own investment, the companies I work with, they're typically putting significant investment into their own reductions. Some are putting investment into their estates where they're doing their own biodiversity net gain, putting in newt ponds and bee hives and butterfly bushes and meadows and so on, and then putting that in their narrative, and that's fine. The only thing I would say is the estates are not necessarily always in the best location. So if they're doing that, if they want to have some significant benefit, at a larger scale, going after some larger projects and have an amazing impact. And that's because, in our case, for example, we will be joining up existing land. So the project I mentioned earlier, which is in Galloway, is immediately next door to a Scottish Wildlife Trust nature reserve. And it's next to a treble SI, next to a marine protected area, next to a special area of conservation. So we're essentially looking at the landscape scale, and that's where these things get much more exciting. Having said that, people improving their estates, nothing wrong with that. They can report on that too.
Thank you. Apologies, I need to jump off now. I've got another meeting I need to go to, but it was great to meet you. I'll catch up with you after this if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Any other questions? No.
Right.
I've got one. Sorry. Hello.
Go on,
Hi,
Emily.
Emily.
Hello. Really interesting. Thank you. We're a sort of a small group of technical experts working in forest risk commodity space for public sector and private sector clients. We're actually having to offset our own carbon emissions. One of the things that we're really keen on supporting and making sure is that any carbon offsets we buy has the financial contribution and or the value and the support actually reaches the people on the ground that are doing the work, the communities or the local partners. Is that something that, you know, I know there's co-benefits and lots of that, but how do we as a user make sure that the offsets we buy truly benefit the people on the ground and aren't just sort of funding the those that are selling and reselling the carbon credits?
That's where the question about margin comes in, and the question about traceability and who retires the units and how they're retired. So if you're, I mean, I'll make the case for ourselves. We have a low commission, so it's typically around 6%, because we have some of our own costs which we deduct before that. So we end up getting about 6%. So that means if you look at our projects where they say, you know, 15 million going into capital grants, which we don't have a percent from that at all, that is flowing into the supply chain. So that money is going into forestry companies, it's going into deer, fencing, subcontractors. You know, some of these fences are miles long and 3 meters high. It's going into tree nurseries who are producing the saplings. It goes into the forestry suppliers who are planting them on the ground, goes into the crews who are doing groundwork. So that includes access lanes, it includes mounding before the trees are planted. It's going into indirectly a whole bunch of other people, such as people in local restaurants and hotels who have to house the people who are coming in from outside the community and so on. So it's a lot of money flowing in. And we're really keen when some of that actually flows into the estate. And so what we mean is where the estate, because they put in money as well, they have to put in their money on the front end. If they are hiring local people, so we had a project, a peatland project in Wester Ross, where all of the timber and all of the stone for all of the dams that were built on site came from the estate and were sourced by crofters. And the crofters operated all the diggers for the project. Now that's a great example where the local people are getting value added income because the pay for operating machinery is quite high. And the cost to the landowner is small because the materials are local, the carbon miles are low, which is also accounted for within the project. That's the kind of thing that we're really keen on. It's not always possible to that extent because some estates have no crofters, in which case, you know, it could be people coming in from surrounding communities or further out, but they'll be typically generally local. It isn't feasible for somebody to travel, you know, 6 hours to work every day. So they're going to be within a radius of the project.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Is there any others? One of the points I was going to make very quickly is about the Guardian article that came out last year about it was the Vera standard, and it was RED Plus, the RED Plus framework. So the critique there, because I get asked this one a lot by buyers, the critique there was not that they weren't benefiting in terms of reducing deforestation. It was that the deforestation rate around the projects was lower than predicted. And I think that's an important point, because it's not to say that they weren't, that trees were being annihilated and land cleared or anything like that, which would be absolutely awful. There's actually the opposite. So when people ask me about this, the fact that they ask me generally signals to me that the client probably would want to steer away from it. So I consider that when I give them a menu of different options, but I do explain how I understand it, and how I understand it is in effect, REDD+ schemes are a social science, because all of the levers that you pull to slow deforestation are human levers. So you've got education, you've got governance regimes, you've got maintenance, you've got project monitoring. All of these things are human. So predicting those out for a period of 15 years or 25 years is quite tricky. So it doesn't mean that these organizations who set this up have the wrong intention. It can sometimes mean that their educational programs are so successful and the governance regimes change beyond what they had hoped in country, that deforestation rates reduce in a larger area. So it's something to consider. What I don't do is badmouth these schemes as a blanket rule, because I don't think they are all poor. And the official analysis that happened, which is through a third-party consulting firm, it wasn't from the Guardian. It was reported by the Guardian. I think they only reported on 4 exceptions, and there were several that proved the rule, and they didn't report on them. So it's actually an area that's been debated, and something that's been debated since is, what was the interest of the consulting company? Are they working for another framework? And I don't know. Don't get into speculation, but there's some stuff that we don't know about. But I would say that reducing deforestation is a good, high ideal, and Verra are changing their frameworks, they're changing their metrics, and they're doing a lot of consultation. So I hope they recover from it, because it certainly had a big splash. That's all I was going to say about that one. Right. Any other questions, Gwyn, Julia?
I noticed that Giles had his hand up at one point. So I don't know, Giles, did you want to ask another question maybe? Or another point?
Well, yeah, I was just debating whether to stick it in the chat or not, but apologies, Gwyn or Michelle, if you were going to mention this. I don't want to steal your thunder in any way, shape or form, but I was just wondering if there's any scope for, you delivering this presentation to the Humber EcoFest online. It might be worth Gwyn hooking Richard up with Alan Raw.
All in process. Thanks, Giles.
Well, there we go.
Great ideas always have lots of parents.
Yeah, I assume that would be the case. Yeah. Anyway,
maybe Richard, you just like to explain what's happened there, your connections through Alan and the Pat Foundation, just to give an example of what can happen there, because what Giles is talking about is the opportunity for all of you here actually to be present either at Zoom or in person throughout the 3 weeks of the Humber Eco Fest. We connected Richard up with a local foundation, and they've hit it off straight away, and he's got some ideas for what he wants to do there, which are still evolving. So feel free to talk about them, Richard, because we can change them at any time. And this is where Julia comes in. If you've got any desire to work in that way, then please contact Julia and she can sort that out for you. But Richard, a few words?
Yeah, so we've had an initial conversation about appearing in person at that event at some point in one of the venues, and we're working out where that would be, but that there would be an online opportunity like this, so people could come from outside of the area and also take part. So Alan from Pat Foundation will be doing that, and we're also looking at collaborating in other ways. I'm working on finding some land for him to support tree planting. So I do support tree planting. I'm passionate about it, and hopefully we can do some more of that in addition to the offsetting stuff that's going on.
Oh yeah, that's a good example, because we invited Richard to talk with these people about doing a a joint event, and it looks like they might be actually doing some business together. And of course, that's a very important aspect for all of us. We all have to earn our living. So at the end of the day, this is a win-win-win, hopefully, in many different ways for Richard and for the whole and the Humber community. So thanks for bringing that point up, Giles. We've got plenty of time if people want to ask questions, but of course we don't need to waste it. I know you're all busy and it's lunchtime, so we won't just hang around for the sake of it. Any last questions? Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much for attending today. I've just put a note in the chat. The recording will be available within about 24 hours. We'll put that up via the website with the presentation, so that you can either send it to your team members if of any interest, or look at it yourself. It will also be out on the newsletter coming out mid-October, early October. And just to reiterate again Giles's point, yep, we've got plenty of opportunities to support the Humber Eco Fest, which is fundamentally a celebration of the positive things that are happening around the Humber area. And I think Richard's conversation today definitely fitted into that category of positivism, and that's what we need to remind us that there's a lot of good going on, as well as some of the less good that we're hearing about. So let's keep more of the good news going as well, so that we can all stay highly motivated and effective.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for everything you're doing in your own time. Thank you to Gwyn and to Julia for hosting this. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks a lot, Julia.
Thanks all.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, guys. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, so yeah, take care if you're in the path of the storm this afternoon, as indeed we are up in here in the